Take two. Welcome to the critical weight theory and my show within a show called the Quadruple D. So, the House recently and narrowly passed President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, which I simply call the Big Ugly Bill, a sweeping tax and spending package that, despite White House claims, is projected by multiple independent analyses to significantly increase the federal deficit. The Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, estimates the bill would add $3.8 trillion dollars to the deficit over the next decade. The Joint Committee on Taxation and the Penn Wharton budget model both predict similar increases even when accounting for potential economic growth. So imagine that, they're lying about it. And that's why my quadruple D for the week is White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, because she has been, the face of the lies in many ways. She asserted that the bill would save $1.6 trillion, dollars, referencing proposed spending cuts. However, this figure does not account for the substantial revenue losses from tax cuts, which are projected to reduce federal tax revenue by $4.1 trillion dollars from 2025 through 2034. And you can find information on that from the Tax Foundation. The bill extends and expands provisions from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, including a permanent increase in the estate tax exemption, allowing couples to pass up to $30 million tax-free to heirs, the people who inherit the wealth, and maintains a 37% top tax rate for high-income earners. These changes are expected to cost $212 billion dollars and $1.4 trillion dollars, respectively. Additionally, pass-through entities, including wealthy family offices, benefit from an increased business deduction from 20% to 23%, adding an estimated $820 billion dollars to the deficit. So, to offset these tax cuts, the bill proposes $1.6 trillion dollars in spending reductions, primarily targeting social programs. So imagine that. And Medicaid faces cuts of approximately $700 billion, dollars, and the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, also known as SNAP, would see a $267 billion reduction over 10 years. So here's a fun fact: there are some Trump supporters who benefit from these programs. These cuts are projected to result in 8.6 million fewer people with health care coverage and 3 million fewer individuals receiving monthly SNAP benefits. So keep in mind, that's all happening because you need to have more yachts and more mansions and private jets for millionaires and billionaires. And maybe they need to spend more time out there golfing, you know? Maybe acquire more property throughout the country so they can, dominate the economy in that way. Maybe they can swallow up more businesses and whatnot too. They can command more control over the economy generally, acquiring more, private property and intellectual property. So the legislation also includes significant increases in military and border so called security spending. It allocates $150 billion dollars to the Pentagon, including funding for the president's new Golden Dome defense shield and $175 billion dollars for immigration enforcement, because you got to crack down on those wicked foreigners even more, encompassing the completion of Trump's border wall and enhancements to customs and border protection facilities. Wow. Imagine that, You can't spend more money on feeding people. You gotta spend more money on beating people. You gotta beat them, bomb them, shoot at them, starve them, maybe throw them in a prison cell, or at the very least, kick poor people out of town, out of sight, out of mind. Or, you could have private prison labor boom with the people you're going to potentially just criminalize because they're trying to get rid of due process as I speak. So, declare somebody a terrorist gang member, and wow, you can just throw them in prison and exploit their labor at a cheap price. Isn't that neat? It's almost like it's a convenient way to exploit people, and at the same time you appear like you're tough on crime. You don't need a trial to prove that they're guilty of anything. If somebody has a tattoo and somebody like uh, the head of the Department of Homeland Security says it's a gang tattoo, or somebody in ICE, or just some random cop in some hick town or city wants to say, "Oh, that's a gang tattoo," well, you can just throw that person in prison now. That's like the ideal here. That's the zenith of human experience at the moment, is just rounding people up and putting them in a cell, kicking them out of the country, and you're making everybody strong and free. Just like the authoritarian countries of old. So critics argue, and I am one of those critics, but anyway, critics argue that the bill in question disproportionately benefits the wealthy while imposing hardships on low income individuals. And how could you even argue otherwise? That's literally what it does. The CBO notes that the lowest income households would see their resources decrease, while the highest income households would experience gains. Better luck next time. Yeah, well, you only have one life to live, presumably, but uh, maybe there is an afterlife. Maybe you'll go to heaven and you'll attain the riches there, or something like that. It's the roll of the dice. It's the way the cookie crumbles, and you're just poop out of luck, I guess. So, furthermore, the bill's reliance on optimistic economic growth projections to offset revenue losses is viewed as unrealistic by many economists. And the bill exemplifies the state's typical prioritization of elite interests over the well being of the general populace. The substantial tax breaks for the wealthy, coupled with cuts to essential social programs and increased funding for military and border enforcement, reflect a governance model that reinforces systemic inequalities and state power structures at the expense of the poor and working class. So, as the bill moves to the Senate, its future remains uncertain. However, its passage to the House exposes the ongoing tensions between fiscal policy, social equity, and the role of government in addressing the needs of its citizens. So, yes, Leavitt is my quadruple D of the week for being a pathetic propagandist. And unfortunately, this episode I'm going to be picking on the ladies, because the next person, my peripheral poophead of the week, is Elise Stefanik. Uh, Karoline Leavitt was previously a communications director for New York Representative Elise Stefanik. So that's kind of why I'm choosing her as the person here, because there's a little bit of a link, and she's not receiving quite as much coverage anymore after she is staying as a Congress creature. So Elise Stefanik was born on July 2, 1984, so she's actually 3 years younger than me. She represents New York's 21st congressional district, encompassing, much of the North Country and the Adirondack Mountains. At age 30, she became the youngest woman ever elected to Congress in 2014, defeating a Democrat named Aaron Wolf with 63% of the vote. And initially seen as a moderate Republican, Stefanik's political stance shifted significantly during Donald Trump's first presidency. She emerged as a staunch defender of Trump, notably opposing his first impeachment in 2019 related to the Trump Ukraine scandal. In 2021, she dutifully objected to Pennsylvania's electoral votes following the Capitol attack, aligning with efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. So she is a Trump sycophant to the core, despite initially appearing as a more moderate political figure. Stefanik's alignment with Trump extended to foreign policy, of course. She has expressed strong so called pro Israel views, asserting that Israel has a biblical right to the occupied West Bank. So imagine that being the rationale. The invisible sky man is telling me that you have a right to this territory. That's sound logic. Well, my invisible skyman is bigger than yours, so it says I have a right to blah 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 blah. I can own this territory or I can own that. I'm the king of the neighborhood. My God is bigger than yours, so it's telling me to kick you out. That's the rationale there, and it's as flimsy as any sort of rationale can be. But anyway, it's a stance that aligns with the Trump administration's U.S. policy supporting Israeli settlement, expansion, and annexation efforts, which, as you most likely know, has killed, at the very least, tens of thousands of Palestinians, although more updated estimates are that at least 100,000 may have been killed by now. And there is a policy of deliberate starvation. They've bombed every hospital, and every school or university has been reduced to rubble. And they've killed aid workers. They've killed journalists. The IDF have killed all those different types of people. And right now, it's considered a scandal just to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be deliberately starving people to death. And that is what the government of, Netanyahu has admitted that they're doing. They are openly admitting that they are starving people to death. It's a part of their policy. They've said that they're deliberately cutting off electricity, all food aid, medical aid. So if a kid gets his or her arm blown off, they might have to undergo surgery with no anesthesia and stuff like that. And of course, there are reports that people are, kids are deliberately being sniped, you know, assassinated. So yeah, that's apparently wholesome family values on display. So in December 2023, Stefanik gained national attention during a congressional hearing on anti Semitism, where she questioned the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania. Her pointed inquiries about whether calls for the genocide of Jews violated university conduct codes led to widespread criticism of the university leaders' responses. Subsequently, University of Pennsylvania President Liz McGill resigned. Stefanik's actions have drawn both support and criticism. She was honored with the Dr. Miriam and Sheldon G. Adelson Defender of Israel Award by the Zionist Organization of America in March 2024. However, her positions have also sparked controversy, particularly among those concerned about the implications of conflating political activism, against things like a mass murder campaign with anti Semitism. and the potential suppression of free speech on college campuses. Well, I shouldn't say potential because it's happening. There's no longer just potential; it's actually an ongoing process. So, while I'm discussing this, keep in mind that there are notable figures with anti-Semitic views associated with Trump. So it's a little bit weird to target just these activists on campus who in many cases are actually not anti-Semitic. They are just in disagreement with Netanyahu and the human rights abuses that have been well documented. But one of the figures, known anti-Semite who had dinner with Trump right around the time that Trump kicked off his 2024 campaign, the character known as Nick Fuentes. He's a white nationalist and Holocaust denier. He attended that dinner at Mar-a-Lago with Trump and Kanye West in November 2022. And keep in mind, this was at a time when Kanye West was receiving widespread news coverage for his own, you know, Nazi style rants against Jewish people. He was praising Hitler and stuff like that. And he has still been doing that, since then. But anyway, Fuentes has a long history of promoting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and participated in the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where the well-known chant was "Jews will not replace us." So it's a little bit curious that the U.S. government isn't going after him, targeting his speech. I'm not even saying that it should necessarily, but if you want to be logically consistent, they would go after him. And the same thing is true of Kanye West, or now he wants to be known as Ye. He's a well-known rapper, pretty much one of the most well-known rappers of all time. He made several anti-Semitic statements in 2022 and beyond, and surely earlier than that. And he, like I said, he praised Adolf Hitler and denied the Holocaust. And his remarks led to the termination of multiple business partnerships. But yet, how come the government isn't going after him in any way, shape, or form? It's a little odd, isn't it? And there's also David Duke, the former Ku Klux Klan leader who endorsed Trump in 2016, stating that voting against Trump would be treason to your heritage. Oh, why would he say that? It's a little bit of an odd thing to say. Anyway, Trump initially hesitated to disavow Duke's support, but later condemned him because, he still sometimes succumbs to public pressure. And the point remains, if you're going to go after people based on them being anti-Semitic, well, I've already rattled off three well-known anti-Semites who haven't received any sort of condemnation from the government. Where's the terrorist designation for these three? Especially like the former KKK leader David Duke. There's also Richard B. Spencer, who was a prominent white supremacist. Now he kind of claims he isn't one. I don't know. I'll let you debate about that. But Spencer at one point led chants of "Hail Trump" at a 2016 alt-right conference. He's been a vocal supporter of Trump's presidency and definitely a white nationalist, white supremacist type. And a lesser known one, but also, worth considering is a man named Kevin McDonald. No, he's not the guy from The Kids in the Hall. This is an academic known for anti Semitic writings. McDonald was associated with white nationalist groups, and he has expressed support for Trump. Now, I have to admit, like back when I was doing more online debate forum kind of stuff, back in the early 2000s when I was spending time at Volcanvo, I actually did quote a Kevin McDonald article, but it was asking, why are there so many prominent Jewish right wingers? So I took a little bit of heat for that at the time because it seemed like I was endorsing all of Kevin McDonald's views or something along those lines. But nevertheless, it's somebody who's known to be anti-Semitic, and he has not received any level of significant scrutiny. He hasn't been publicly talked about in the same way that these campus protesters have. And I'm not a fan of his just because I quoted one of his articles like back in like literally 20 years ago or something like that. But it just goes to show you that they're ignoring like all these different types of people while demonizing young college students. And there's another controversy that's pretty worth attention to, the Hitler book controversy. In the 1990s, Donald Trump was reported to have owned a book of Adolf Hitler's speeches called My New Order. And this was noted by Barbara Walters when she was interviewing him in 1990. So the allegations that Trump has Hitler sympathies goes back all the way to the 1990s. And there was a 1990 profile by Marie Brenner for Vanity Fair, and it revealed that the book was found in Trump's bedside cabinet. So keep that in mind. That's a little bit different from having a personal library that just happens to have a few books that could be considered offensive. This is a bedside sort of book. You know what I mean? Like, it's possible to have some books out there. If you got especially a large library of books that might have some offensive connotations or what have you. But why would you keep it by your bedside? That's a little bit strange. But when questioned by Barbara Walters, Trump initially, he seemed to deny owning it, but then acknowledged he had it and claimed he had been given it by a Jewish friend or somebody who may have been Jewish, is what he said. So the defense was oddly irrelevant and disturbing, seeming this single lack of awareness or concern about the implications of, possessing a volume of Nazi propaganda, at your bedside. And, it signified guilt too, because he was trying to say that, oh, it may have been given to me by this Jewish person. So, My New Order compiles Hitler's speeches from 1918 to 1941 and was popular among Nazi sympathizers and strategists for its insights into Hitler's propaganda methods. So keep that in mind, when we're talking about anti-Semitism. Again, it's not necessarily offensive to own a book or a movie or something like that that has some offensive elements to it, right? You might just be trying to understand history or something along those lines. But most people don't keep that kind of stuff by their bedside table if they have it. Like if I had a book of speeches by Stalin or something like that, and speeches by other historical figures, um, like Martin Luther King. Maybe you're just interested in a lot of different historical speeches. That would seem forgivable, but Trump demonstrated a guilty conscience. I said conscience here, and it suggests that he knew there was something a little bit off with having it. So this is not just about having a controversial book. Again, it's about how Trump responded when asked. Rather than treat it with gravity, he deflected with a casual, almost flippant explanation, suggesting maybe a fascination with authoritarian power and racist rhetoric. And, on that point, there's the poisoning the blood quote that Trump is now known for, which definitely has echoes of fascist rhetoric. It's something that could have come straight from Adolf Hitler's mouth himself. So in late 2023, Trump claimed immigrants were poisoning the blood of our country. This phrasing, which is known as Blutvergiftung in German, or blood poisoning, is pulled directly from fascist and Nazi ideology, which portrayed Jewish people and other marginalized groups as contaminants to the racial purity of the nation. This language isn't incidental either. Hitler frequently invoked such biological metaphors in Mein Kampf to describe Jews. So the use of similar phrases today is not just historical echo, but ideological alignment. So, this reveals how state power often co opts pseudoscientific racism to justify violence, surveillance, and exclusion. Sort of like what the demonic anarchists would accuse the state of being built upon. And I'm, as I usually do in these episodes, I'm going to note how the uh, the Trump administration further validates a lot of anarchist critiques of power. So then there's also Trump's statement that immigrants are eating dogs and cats, which is a blood tribe conspiracy. I'll get more into that here. So in a 2024 speech, Trump repeated a bizarre and racist conspiracy theory that immigrants were eating cats and dogs in Ohio. The claim originated from Blood Tribe, a neo Nazi group active in the US, which uses such stories to paint immigrants, especially Latinos and Asians, as uncivilized, dangerous, and un American. So, by repeating this talking point, Trump didn't just echo white nationalist and white supremacist paranoia, he amplified it from the largest possible megaphone, a former US president and leading presidential candidate, and now he is the president again. So the result is the laundering of Nazi propaganda into national political discourse. And I know some old ladies who were walking around the mall that I happen to work at, and I brought that up. I was like, can you believe this thing that Trump said about them eating cats and dogs? And one of the ladies said, "Yeah, that was proven. That was proven that they were doing that." So the propaganda works, and it's a little bit disheartening to know that some of the people out there who are Nazi aligned are these little old ladies and stuff like that. These otherwise potentially innocent people who are either too ignorant or stupid or whatever you want to call them, but they're too whatever to understand that this is hateful propaganda. And you know that's one of the scary things about this whole situation is the banality of evil. The people who are your neighbors, your friends, your family, some of them might be susceptible to this type of propaganda. So most recently, there was the claims by Trump that there is a white genocide in South Africa, which is a white nationalist talking point. Trump has, he's promoted the far right conspiracy theory of a white genocide in South Africa. This happened in 2025, recently. He was meeting with the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, and he presented gruesome photos of supposed victims of anti white violence on farms, photos that were later shown to be from the Democratic Republic of Congo, not from South Africa. So he's lying again. The long-standing pattern of Donald Trump lying. He lies almost every time he opens his fucking mouth. He is such a liar. Anyway, the myth has long been pushed by white nationalist groups to stoke racial fear and justify calls for a defense of Western civilization, sort of like what Elon Musk has been talking about. He talks a lot about the need to protect Western civilization. And what does he mean by that? He means white people. So, in fact, South African government data consistently shows that farm murders affect all races and white farmers are not disproportionately targeted. So, Trump's parroting of this lie is a direct appeal to the international far right and a bid to consolidate the support of white grievance politics. So, there's further hypocrisy on anti Semitism, too. Trump and his allies have repeatedly labeled student protests against Israel or U.S. foreign policy as anti-Semitic, weaponizing the term to silence dissent. Yet Trump refuses to label actual anti-Semitic terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazi organizations as such, while his administration floated labeling MS-13 and Venezuela's Tren de Aragua as foreign terrorist organizations. Well, he hasn't just floated doing that, he's actually done that. But for a time, he was, talking about doing that on the campaign trail. But while he's labeling MS-13 and Tren de Aragua as terrorist organizations, white supremacist violence has been downplayed and they're not labeled as such, terroristy organizations. And despite them being, among the top domestic terror threats according to the FBI, or, according to the previous FBI, we don't know how far Donald Trump has reduced, the efforts to, you know, target any such group, but it's reasonable to think he is downplaying them, the danger of those groups even more with the current trajectory of his rhetoric and his constant bashing of immigrants. So his selective outrage isn't about protecting Jewish communities, it's about using the language of anti Semitism to crush opposition and shield political allies. Meanwhile, his association with anti Semites like Nick Fuentes and David Duke and the mainstreaming of their rhetoric go largely unaddressed. And that's been a major failing of the media. So, the final word on this particular topic, sort of from an anarchic lens, is that Trump's rhetoric and associations make clear that his project is not one of democratic governance, but of racial hierarchy, cultural purity, and authoritarian nostalgia. This is also why he's trying to emphasize things like the Gulf of America and, the supremacy of English as, the national language and stuff like that. So the refusal to meaningly oppose white supremacy while demonizing protests and immigrants is not accidental. It's a strategic thing and it's dangerous. Meanwhile, going back to Elise Stefanik, her trajectory reflects the consolidation of power and alignment with authoritarian tendencies in the political system. She supports policies that undermine democratic processes and suppress dissenting voices, and it raises concerns about the erosion of individual freedom and the perpetuation of state violence.